Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, longtime Senate staffer and author Arnold Punaro on confirmations for national security positions.
I call it confirmation purgatory. You know, you get out of the committee, you go to the Senate executive calendar, you don't know if you're going to heaven or hell, and you don't know how long you're going to be in purgatory. And some people never get through. Some people get through like you finally got to heaven, but it took a long time. Administrations don't really use the two-way street of advice, not just when it comes to nominations, but in just about any area. It's really more of a confrontational approach rather than a consultative approach. And that's not what the Founding Fathers envisioned. We basically advise people to use what we call the artful dodge. And that is, Senator, you know, since I'm not confirmed, I'm not sufficiently well informed on that particular issue to be able to give you the thoughtful answer you deserve. But if confirmed, that's something that I will undertake right away and before they getting back to you. So you basically just dodge the answer.
Arnold Punaro, thank you for joining me on Chatter.
Privileged to be with you.
Confirmation for national security positions in the U.S. government, especially military positions, is something that is all around us, with thousands of confirmations going on every year. And yet most people don't really understand the history and the details of the process. But you've had extraordinary experiences with this process across the decades, and I want to chat with you about that today. Let's go back a little bit earlier, though. Tell us the story of how you went from serving in the Marine Corps and your experiences there to beginning on Capitol Hill.
Well, David, again, great privilege to be with you. These are some of the most important and consequential jobs we have in government. On the military side, these are the people that command our troops in combat. On the civilian side, these are the people that are charged under the law with organizing and training our military so they can always prevail against our adversaries. I graduated in 1968 from college. Frankly, that was the peak year of the draft. My father, who fought with the Army in World War II with Patton's Army, said, "Well, you don't want to be drafted. You'll end up going to Vietnam, and war is hell." So I volunteered for the Marine Corps, and I ended up in Vietnam quicker than I ever would have if I'd have been drafted. So I've served my 4 years of active duty, went back to graduate school at the University of Georgia, and then I was coming back up here to marry my wife-to-be. I didn't have a job. She had a great job in government, and Senator Sam Nunn had started an academic internship program. So I applied for it, got picked up. I was only supposed to last 10 weeks, and I ended up working for him for 24 years, all the years he was in the U.S. Senate. So really kind of lucked into it, but very fortunate. And of course, part of the responsibility of a United States Senator is the advising consent process, where they have to approve presidential, civilian, and military nominations.
And you certainly weren't the only one in that era who was moving from military service to serving in a different capacity. But how many Marines did you find were your cohorts, your people who were working with you on the Hill? Did you stand out in that role?
Well, there were the good news was when I went to the U.S. Senate, but fortunately, we had in the Senate these legendary senators that had served in World War II, Korea. Obviously, the Vietnam senators came. You're talking about legends like Medal of Honor recipient Danny of Norway, Bob Dole, seriously wounded in combat, John Warner, who served both in World War II and in Korea, John Glenn, who served in World War II and Korea, John McCain, Vietnam prisoner of war, who came to the United States Senate. You had, so in that era also, there were people like myself that had been veterans, because let's face it, there over, millions and millions of Americans actually served in the Vietnam War, which went on for 10 years. Obviously, we pulled all our troops out in the early 70s, and Vietnam fell to the North Vietnamese and the Chinese in 75. But we had most of the years, Mike Mansfield was the majority leader in the Senate when I got there. Mike Mansfield that was a Marine in World War II. And to show you, here's an individual that was the majority leader of the United States Senate, asked by President Carter to be his ambassador to Japan, was so prominent, Ronald Reagan, a Republican president, asked the Democratic majority leader to stay on as ambassador to Japan. Mike Mansfield retired with all the accolades he had. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and the only thing on his tombstone in Arlington National Cemetery is Private United States Marine Corps. That's what he was the proudest of. So we don't have very many veterans in Congress today, which is unfortunate.
It is. I've noticed that in the last few years, there's a bit of an uptick, or it appears to be, from veterans of experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, and even people who have served in national security positions in the executive branch, if not military service. But it certainly is a different era than it was then, when it was certainly not required, but it was quite common and very common for senators serving in Foreign Relations Committee, Armed Services Committee, right. And that's not universal now. That's right. It was always seen as an advantage, not so much. But you're right. We have a lot of young members of both sides of the aisle, both in the House and the Senate. When I was there, 70% vets in Congress was 70%. Now it's about 20%. Wow. But you're right. We have 80 new younger veterans that have come in both sides of the aisle, which are pushing up in seniority on both the Armed Services, Defense Appropriations, Foreign Relations, and Intelligence Committee. So that's a good sign. Yeah. And right now, we have roughly the same number of people that are veterans, 18 million. It was the same number we had at the end of World War II, 18 million veterans. Shocking. Well, I do want to talk about the process of nomination, confirmation, and appointment for national security positions. And to do that, we have to go way back. We have to go back to the Constitution itself, and we have to go to Article 2, Section 2. What does it explicitly say, and how does it set the stage for everything that has evolved since then? Well, our founding fathers, and I'm in the camp that believes they were very brilliant and foresighted. They wanted, separation of powers. They did not any one branch of government to be so powerful that they could dominate all decision making. And of course, we had just revolted from a monarchy, revolted from a king, got our independence in the Revolutionary War with the Minutemen and George Washington as our first commander in the field, and then as our first president. But as they set things up, they wanted this divided government, the executive branch, the legislative branch, and judicial branch, three separate but equal branches of government. And so while the founding fathers believed that an executive, the president, ought to have priority in terms of the people he needs to run the executive branch of government, they wanted the legislative branch to have a role. And so the way they set up the advising consent for certain senior officials of government, they have to go through the Senate confirmation process. And the Senate, of course, has added a lot over the years. In the early days, it was only a small handful. You could count on one hand the number that had to go through the confirmation process. Let me turn this off. Now, there's 1,200 civilians that go through that are eligible to go through the confirmation process every year. And then there are over 50,000 military nominations, including close to 1,000 generals and flight officers that go through the confirmation process. So the founding fathers had it correct in terms of the balance of power. They never would have envisioned the large numbers of political appointees that go through the confirmation process today. I think you're right about that. It seems there's a lot they would not have anticipated about 200 plus years in the future, but I got to cut them some slack on that because I can't envision things 2 weeks in the future very well. So they did pretty well where they were at. Now, it's interesting. In the Constitution, it uses that phrase that you cited, which is advice and consent. Now, that is open to interpretation, and the Senate has chosen to interpret it in a certain way. So consent means we're going to have a vote of the Senate, and that decides whether or not we support this nomination, and you can go ahead and appoint the person to that position. The thing that's always struck me funny is that handles the consent part. But there is no formalized similar structure for the advice part. The Senate has not taken it upon itself to force a constitutional issue with the president of, before making a nomination, we must formally advise you. That is, you must come to the Senate and say, what do you all think? Instead, it's really focused on the consent part, but hopefully senators try to get that advice part in by informal consultations before a nomination is made in certain cases, or as part of the actual confirmation process itself.
Well, David, that's the way it ought to work. That's the way with founding fathers, a two-way street, coordination, cooperation, consultation. Over the years, however, that part has kind of gone fallow. You don't see as much on the advice side, and frankly, that's the way it ought to work. I'll give a good example. When Dick Cheney became the Secretary of Defense, when George Bush was president, they would come to the Senate in advance, not formally, but informally, and say, look, here's some of the people that we're looking at to send up as possible secretaries of the Air Force, secretaries of the Navy, undersecretary for personnel. Do you all have any advice? The Senate was always very careful not to predict what we're going to do or not do, but you could say, oh, yes, we know that person and they're going to run into some pretty big headwinds, or no, that person probably sounds pretty good. And so you had a lot more what I call coordination and consultation years past. Now, I call it the throw it over the transom mode. Basically nothing in advance. They just send it up there and take their chances. And of course, this is one of the reasons I think the process has gone from, it worked well when I first got to the Senate in the early 70s. Then it got kind of badly bent over time. Now it's totally broken. And one of the reasons it's broken is administrations don't really use the two-way street of advice, not just when it comes to nominations, but in just about any area. It's really, just executive, legislative, more of a confrontational approach rather than a consultative approach. And that's not what the founding fathers envisioned.
And the norms have changed in two ways. And I think that's perhaps the most important, is the norm of, respect, if you will, of actually,
right,
seeking advice and listening rather than just saying, here is the nominee. But I've always been struck by a historical case. It's outside the national security realm. It involves a Supreme Court justice. But in 1841, Martin Van Buren was about to leave office. He had been voted out in the election of 1840. He had less than a week left in his term. So that's about as lame as a duck gets. But he nominated Peter Daniel to the Supreme Court. And can you imagine that happening in today's era? I mean, it's hard to imagine someone getting nominated within a year of an election and not having some controversy, but he had less than a week left in his term. He nominated this person to the Supreme Court, and there was some grumbling. There were some people in Congress who said that's inappropriate, but they went ahead and confirmed him because the norm was you confirm nominees unless there is something extraordinarily and historically uniquely bad about them. Now, of course, the confirmation process is wrapped up in so many other things. But the core point is it is a constitutional process. It does come from the founding document of our country, at least when it comes to the concept of voting to confirm. But as you pointed out, it's evolved a lot over the centuries and the decades. The Constitution doesn't say anything about the Senate Armed Services Committee and committee votes and committee rules. So talk a little bit about the committee itself and how the committee, in terms of these military positions in particular, how the committee mediates that process from the nomination from the president to the confirmation vote of the Senate. What does the committee do in between?
Well, starting with your excellent example of the Supreme Court, back in those days, the court, the judicial branch of government, was not nearly as prominent as it is today, and people weren't as litigious, and everything that anybody wants to do didn't end up getting litigated in the courts and ultimately going up to the Supreme Court. So there was a lot less controversy, but like you said, there's no way in hallelujah that anybody nominated to a federal judicial position could get through in 1 week in today's environment. And but on the Senate Armed Services Committee, starting in the early days, you had several committees that looked at the military. which were all consolidated at the end of World War II, when we also consolidated the War Department and the Navy Department. During World War II, we had two really different departments. We had the War Department, which was the Army and the Army Air Corps, and the Navy Department, which was the Navy and the United States Marine Corps. It was consolidated into the Department of Defense. The Senate Armed Services Committee was consolidated into the committee that it is today. And of course, under Senate rules, you're correct. The president sends the nomination to the Senate. It's received by the Senate clerk, and the clerk decides what committee has the jurisdiction. It's referred to the committee. So when it comes to national security nominees, military and civilian, when it comes to Department of Energy, nuclear weapons, when it comes to the Court of Military Appeals, the Nuclear Facility Safety Board, and some of the intelligence nominations, those are all referred to the jurisdiction of the Senate Armed Services Committee. The Senate Armed Services Committee is one of the few committees on the Hill that still operates in a very bipartisan fashion. Obviously, they have some squabbles from time to time, but for 62 plus years, they passed a bipartisan defense authorization bill. The committees on the House side is the same. They still operate. It doesn't matter if it's run by Democrats or Republicans. It still operates in a very bipartisan way. I will say, though, however, we've had more controversies in terms of nominees in recent years than we would have had, say, 10 or 15 years ago. And one of the reasons is social media. People that basically are not in government tend to basically put things out on social media, and some of those social media posts could be rather harsh, talking about other people. When they're up for confirmation, the committee looks at all those records, and if you said something pretty unkind about somebody in the other party, you're going to have pretty rough sledding getting through the confirmation process. A pretty good example of that was recently Derek Chalet was nominated to be the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, which is one of the most senior positions in the department. He'd actually been confirmed as an Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration, and in the Biden administration, he had a senior position in the State Department. The Republicans on the committee were quite concerned about some of the positions he'd taken at the State Department, as well as his involvement in the precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan. While they had a hearing, he got some pretty tough questions, never got reported out of committee. Looks like he probably didn't have the votes to get out of committee, meaning there was probably a Democrat that was concerned about his nomination as well. So ultimately, they just made him the Chief of Staff to the current Secretary of Defense. He never got through.
Yeah. And to note, that process you just described about the committee having conversations, trying to determine if there will be enough votes, and then actually getting out of committee to the Senate, that is all by Senate rule and by tradition and custom, right? None of that's correct. Legislated.
The Senate makes its own rules. And so none of that's in the Constitution. And everything in the Senate, you really need to understand the United States Senate. You need to understand procedure. Everything in the Senate is about procedure and a process. And if you understand the parliamentary procedure, it's a real advantage for you. And if you don't understand it, it's a real disadvantage. And there have been some real masters of that. Senator Robert Byrd, a legendary member of the United States Senate, was considered one of the most legendary people in terms of using the Senate rules. And nowadays, of course, everything in the Senate operates under what's called unanimous consent, meaning any one senator can block anything in the U.S. Senate. And if you block it, that's called a filibuster, and you have to get 60 votes in the Senate to stop a filibuster, which is called cloture. And with an evenly divided Senate, as it has been for many, many years now, very, very difficult to get 60 votes for anything. And so, for example, all federal judges now have to go through the cloture process. Mm-hmm. Senator Harry Reid, when he was the majority leader, changed that rule to basically no longer need 60 votes for cloture for a judge. You only needed 51. You get cloture, and then you only needed 51 votes to approve that nomination. So all federal judges now, it was the same during Trump, it's the same during Biden. They get to the Judiciary Committee. Ultimately, they get out of the Judiciary Committee most of the time on a party line vote. They get on the executive calendar, somebody puts a hold on them, and the only way you're going to get them through is with cloture. And you can only do cloture maybe 2 a week because it takes 2.5 days for that process to become eligible for a vote. The Senate, unfortunately, only works from Tuesday afternoon to Thursday morning. So you can't get a lot of work done in that short period of time. So this is why nominations are so slow-rolled and gummed up.
Yeah.
It's the fact that you can't get unanimous consent for just about anything anymore, and their work week is pretty slim.
No kidding. Well, I've made a note here on something you just mentioned, which is the holds, because I do want to come back to some prominent holds we've had recently. But first, I want to make sure that we have a common understanding of the entire process. So let's talk about the process step by step. And I'll pull here from your new book, which I should highlight for everyone, called If Confirmed, An Insider's View of the National Security Confirmation Process. And I'll ask you to share experiences along the way of things you've seen, things that have gone well or things that have gone poorly at each stage. So first, before even the presidential nomination occurs, there is or should be executive branch vetting. In your experience, what are the best practices of that executive branch vetting, and what are some cases of what happens when it has not been as complete as it should be?
Well, David, that's a really excellent point. And the vetting, the best practice is to make sure the person that you're going to recommend, the staff is going to recommend to the president, has been fully checked out, including with what we call the Federal Bureau of Investigation's full field investigation. All their taxes checked out, all their issues checked out. For example, you paid all your taxes on your domestic help and things of that nature. Because there have been examples of presidents that didn't check that out, name somebody, and then when they check it out, they find out they have a problem, and then they're embarrassed because they have to withdraw the name or not nominate the person. So, and frankly, that process now is very, very lengthy. The SF-86, which is your national security clearance form, can be hundreds of pages long.
I remember it all.
Get all your taxes.
It is an adventure to fill out an SF-86.
And it's all paperwork laden. And of course, when you're dealing with 1,200 potential nominees, that's a lot of work for the White House counsel's office. So some examples of people that didn't check it out sufficiently in the Clinton administration, Zoe Beard was nominated to be the Attorney General. And basically, she and her husband had domestic help and they didn't pay them properly, and so their nomination had to be withdrawn. Mayor Tandon basically was nominated in the Biden administration to be the head of OMB. She had run one of the big progressive think tanks in town, a highly qualified individual by all accounts, but she'd had some real problems with tweets and things of that nature, and they didn't check it out sufficiently. And so there are a lot of examples of that over the years where the vetting process in the executive branch has been less than thorough, and those people's names get out there, and then they either the president has to pull the name back, or if it's already in the Senate, withdraw the name. And so it's very embarrassing. And so they should spend a lot of time checking everything out. And one of the questions they ask people now, is there anything in your background that if it came out would be embarrassing to the president? And some people basically have tried to hide and not answer that question. And when it comes out later, the issue really wasn't that consequential, but because they withheld it from the White House vetting process, they get to guillotine and their nom doesn't get out of the White House. So that really ought to be one of the most thorough processes before anybody ever even gets sent to the United States Senate.
Right. Now, I understand that, and we've all heard the phrase intent to nominate, that sometimes the administration will declare that they are going to nominate somebody, and it may be in consultation with members of the Senate or others, but there is no requirement for there to be an intent to nominate. The actual constitutional trigger for the advice and consent is the nomination, right?
Correct. And they use intent to nominate for several purposes. One, let's say you have a very senior position that's vacant and they've been taking their sweet time getting the name out there, and they're getting a lot of pressure from that agency head or acting head and even the Senate. Hey, where's the heck is such and such a nomination? Well, guess what? We have an intent to nominate so-and-so. The clock in the Senate doesn't start till they actually get the nomination to the Senate clerk. Another reason they do intent to nominate is what I call trial balloon. They'll get a name that may be somewhat controversial. They'll kind of get it out in the open and say, maybe we're going to nominate this person. They'll see what happens. What is the reaction when that name is out there? So they use it for two purposes, but you're absolutely right. There's absolutely no standing for an intent to nominate. Mm-hmm. I had a time, the Pentagon, because they had so many nominations when I was the staff director, I'd get senior people that come over from time to time and say, Arnold, holy smokes, you all have got to get such and such a nomination through. This person's going to be the head of the U.S. Central Command, and we've got to get that person out there, to replace the person that's leaving. And what happens is the Pentagon would send the nomination to the White House, but they didn't pay attention to whether or not the president had actually nominated the person. And I'd always say, particularly the nomination's not in the Senate, said, look, there's some people, when we had their nomination, we don't approve them, but we darn sure don't approve anybody whose nomination we don't have. And so basically the Senate clock does not start at all until the nomination actually reaches the Senate clerk, and the Senate clerk receives it, and then it gets referred to the committee of jurisdiction. One reason you don't get nominations in a recess is because there's no clerk to receive the nomination. And so that's basically, so intent to nominate, trial balloons, all that kind of stuff means nothing until the president actually, and only the president can send a nomination to the Senate. The Secretary of Defense, from time to time, they'll say, well, we nominated so-and-so to be the head of the U.S. Southern Command. The Secretary of Defense doesn't nominate anybody, period. They may send a recommendation to the White House to the president, but only the president can make a nomination.
You mentioned something in there, Arnold, I want to come back to, which is you mentioned the Senate being on recess, which does happen, used to happen a lot more, but people have heard the term recess appointment and how that changes the situation a bit. Talk through a recess appointment in national security, both why we would need to do it, but then also how the process changes for that individual when they're in that role.
So basically, the Senate and the House really were not full-time bodies way back when, in the early days of our republic. And they were, part-time, and so there were a lot of times when they weren't there, and so the Constitution set it up where if they weren't there to act on a nomination, the president could make what's called a recess appointment. And a recess appointment has a certain limited time frame they can actually serve. So it's not like a normal thing that goes through the Senate and then you can serve at the pleasure of the president or through the whole president's term, or as long as another president will let you stay there. A recess appointment is limited in terms of the amount of time that individual can serve. What's happened is because President Obama basically nominated some people to the Federal Labor Relations Board during a recess period because the Senate wouldn't act on them. The Senate has cracked down, whether it's run by the Democrats or Republicans, and they don't really technically go into a long enough of a recess. It has to be a certain period for a president to be able to make a recess appointment. So what the Senate does now is they'll have pro forma sessions where some senator, usually somebody that's a local senator, gets called in to open the Senate up for like 30 seconds and then close it back down. So we don't have, there really aren't hardly any, and I can't think of any in recent years, recess appointments anymore because the Senate operates in a way that a president can't make recess appointments. And that really is the Senate saying, look, it's our prerogative to determine whether or not we confirm somebody you nominate. We don't like recess appointments, and we're going to make sure you can't make any recess appointments. So that really is not much of a viable option and the Supreme Court ruled against Obama, so it really strengthened the Senate's hand in terms of blocking recess appointments.
Something else that is a deviation from the normal process, if you will, is having an acting secretary or an acting position for a position that otherwise would require a confirmed individual for that position. Now, there's a lot of nuance here, but there's a way that an acting makes sense for certain senior positions. Can you walk through when it is an acting can perform the duties of an otherwise confirmed position?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. There's a statute called the Federal Vacancies Reform Act that governs the way people can serve and what capacity they can serve in if a Senate confirmed position, they're called PASs, presidentially appointed Senate confirmed position, of which there are 1,200 can serve. And under the Federal Vacancy Act, there are 3 ways an individual can serve in that position. Let's just take the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, which actually is vacant right now in terms of a Senate confirmed position. Now, they have a person serving in that position right now as acting, but it's not, person is not, Kara Abercrombie is not confirmed as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. The first option is the first assistant. If that position has a deputy that's a Senate confirmed deputy that's considered the first assistant, that person can automatically serve as the acting Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and we've had that in the past. The second thing is another Senate confirmed individual can be put in that position. Kara Abercrombie was confirmed to be the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition Policy, and so because she was confirmed by the Senate, they can put her in that position as acting Undersecretary for Policy. The third option, and one that was tried to be used by President Trump and his administration when he wanted to put Anthony Tata in as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, if the position is vacant and you've been in the Department of Defense, if it's a DOD position, for several hundred days prior to when the position was vacant, anybody that's a GS-15 or above could be put in that position. And so there are 3 ways to do that. And then if you are an official acting person, then for the most part, you can undertake the statutory duties, Title 10 duties of that position. If you are performing the duties of, which is a DOD construct, not under the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, you really, all you can do is keep the seat warm. You can't perform any of the Title 10 statutory authorities that go with that position. That has to go to the next higher confirmed person.
Right.
But right now, of the 9 people in OSD policy that require Senate confirmation, 6 are vacant. There's 6 people, 6 of those positions. And right now, DOD-wide, of the 65 Senate confirmed positions, they've got, over 10 that don't have anybody in there, and not likely to have anybody in with only a few months left in the administration.
Yeah.
So you never have all 65 filled at any one time. So you're always going to have situations where you probably have somebody acting or performing the duties of. DOD would argue we have no vacant positions. We have people serving in positions. For example, Dr. Rhoda Plum was the Deputy Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment. She got promoted to be the Chief Digital Officer of the Pentagon, leaving that vacant. So they have Deborah Rosenblum, who's the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical. She's got that ASD, but she's also the acting deputy under, to build a plant. So the DOD would say, Arnold, we don't ever have any vacant positions. But let me tell you, there's a big difference between having somebody in that position that's Senate confirmed and having somebody that's either a career person performing the duties thereof or acting as a career person. A big difference. So you always want to get the Senate confirmed position in those positions in a timely fashion. And that's one of the challenges we face in the confirmation process now. Ron Cahoney, who's the Undersecretary for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, took 18 months from the time he reached the Senate to get confirmed, and nobody had any problem with any of his qualifications. He's remarkably qualified for the position he's in, but because of the slow roll, 18 months for him to get through the confirmation process.
Wow. The situation you describe with, so many positions being unconfirmed at this point, you expect that at the beginning of an administration, right? Because you have something like 7,000 political appointees and so many confirmations. We thankfully have a system where some of the senior most positions, like Secretary of Defense, Deputy Secretary, those are worked out where those can be handled during the transition so that the confirmation can often happen right upon inauguration. But to have that many positions further down late in an administration is just shocking. But it points to the proliferation of positions requiring confirmation, right? Talk a little bit about that. So it used to be that the president had to nominate a handful of people for the Department of Defense when it was created. How many people in and around the Department of Defense now require confirmation, and what does that do to the
gone from that number you could count on both hands under 10 to 65, and they keep adding positions. And so, 65, and you have all these assistant secretaries of defense, and you had those positions before they were undersecretaries for defense. Now you've got a Senate-confirmed supervisor for all the ASDs. So I argue that we could significantly reduce the number of people requiring Senate confirmation, particularly the assistant secretaries of defense. We now have 6 undersecretaries of defense at OSD, and all the ASDs come under them. We also, in the military departments, we have the assistant service secretaries, financial management, manpower and personnel, facilities, things of that nature, and you have a service secretary and you have an undersecretary. So they have political supervision and civilian control. So you could significantly reduce the number of people requiring Senate confirmation. And again, we've gone from under 10 to now 65.
Wow.
And you've got over 62 deputy assistant secretaries of defense in the Pentagon now. So a huge proliferation of these political appointments. And the Senate's just not two ways. It's not set up because of the way it operates in the modern era to handle those numbers, even if you didn't have the slow roll. When you add the slow roll to the modern way the Senate operates, or doesn't operate, I would argue, it's just it's the system. I call it confirmation purgatory. You get out of the committee, you go to the Senate executive calendar. You don't know if you're going to heaven or hell, and you don't know how long you're going to be in purgatory. And some people never get through. Some people get through like Ron after 18 months. He finally got to heaven, but it took a long time. So it's just not a process that works for the modern world we live in, particularly when things happen at the speed of light. I mean, we in the Pentagon have to be able to react 24/7 on a moment's notice, and things happen that were unpredictable. Nobody in August of 1990 thought Saddam Hussein was going to invade Kuwait, and the 1st Marine Division ended up on a moment's notice having to deploy to Saudi Arabia in September of that year. And so that happens all the time now, as you see with the world situation. The world's more turbulent and dangerous than it ever was in the peak of the Cold War, and more uncertain. So it really puts a premium on having people in place immediately. And so the current process, there's just too many to process, and the Senate, the way they work now, is not conducive to the world that we live in.
Well, let's talk a bit about the way that latter part works, the Senate, because we've talked about the president needing to nominate someone, and you mentioned the paperwork, right? So there's the SF-86, there's ethics forms, there's financial forms, there's a lot of paperwork that goes into the executive branch vetting, but that paperwork is not the same as the Senate's paperwork, if I understand it. So as soon as the nomination is made, it gets to the appropriate committee to handle, and then someone in a position like yours that you held for many years is suddenly managing this process of getting a whole bunch of very similar information for a different part of the process. Talk through that and what it's like for a nominee before the nominee actually gets to a hearing, if there is a hearing for that position.
So basically, because the process takes so long in the executive branch, and because for the committees of jurisdiction, particularly the Department of Defense, they know what the Senate Armed Services Committee requires. So they'll tell the nominee, look, if the president picks you and you actually get nominated, here are all the Senate forms you've got to fill out. And they're very different than the executive branch forms because the Senate's a separate but equal branch of government. And they have different information. For example, they want to read and get copies of every article or speech you've given for the last 5 years. They want to see your last 3 years of your tax forms. They're going to look, the chairman and ranking member are going to review the FBI full field investigation, which is only accessible to the White House counsel's office. And they will look to see if there's anything in there that jumps out at them. There's other paperwork that they have to fill out. We have what in the Senate Armed Services Committee is called advanced policy questions for people that are going to have a nomination hearing. They get sent, and now it's can be pages and pages, actually some 92 to 100 plus questions in advance that they have to answer, that they have to get to the committee 3 days before any hearing. And the senators look at that, and they tend to be more routine type questions. They get out of the way because they only get 5 to 7 minutes to actually cross-examine a witness at the hearing. So that's all time consuming and takes a lot of time, and it's all stubby pencil. One of the things I've argued in terms of the reform is everything is done electronically now. Try to do anything in the business world that's not electronic, electronic signatures, but the confirmation process, both in the executive and the legislative branch, is still paperwork, stubby pencil. Let's use the same forms. Let's do it electronically. Let's use electronic signatures, and you could streamline that, and people would know up front, everything that they have to fill out. And of course, once the nomination gets to the Senate, they've got to go through the Office of Government Ethics. They go through an ethics review. The Senate Armed Services Committee, for years, until a couple of years ago, had very different divestiture requirements than the Office of Government Ethics required in the executive branch, much more restrictive. They've kind of gone closer to what the OGE, but it's still a little different because in the Pentagon, our Pentagon spends over $420 billion a year on goods and services, supplies, and equipment. So the people in these senior positions have a lot of influence over doling out a lot of billions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, and you want to make sure there's no conflict or perception of conflict. Mm-hmm. So you don't want them to basically be invested in any of the companies that might benefit from that spending. And so the paperwork monster is real, and it can get you in a lot of trouble. A good example of that was in the Obama administration. Don Rennie was nominated to be the general counsel of the Army, highly qualified individual. When we were doing his prep session, we noticed on his resume that he had not mentioned that he'd worked at Fannie Mae at a time when Fannie Mae had all that huge controversy, and he was not involved in it in any way. And we said, hey, you better put that on your resume, because if you don't, the Senate's going to see that you left it off, and that's going to be a problem for you. He agreed. He said, absolutely, oversight. The White House counsel's office did not want him to put it on there. He didn't put it on his resume. When it got to the Senate Armed Services Committee, the senators caught it, and he didn't get confirmed because they felt like he was withholding something. So he didn't get through because of information he should have put on his form, but he didn't. Now, in the Biden administration, he was nominated to be the number 2 person in VA. All his paperwork was fine. He did a terrific job, and he was more than highly qualified for the Army job. The paperwork caught him. And wow. So, you have to be really, really diligent in that area. But that could be significantly streamlined, just like we could significantly streamline the number of people that actually have to go through the confirmation process.
Right on. Well, the process involves paperwork, obviously. Best practices for senior nominees, but probably for all who can do it, is to make yourself available for courtesy calls, right? To have those conversations with the senators, and if not with senators, perhaps with senior staff. But for many positions, there ends up being a hearing. Now, that's what's visible to the American public. Whether people pay attention or not, the hearings are the things that almost everybody associates with these appointments. But let's talk for a minute about the many, many positions that either don't have formal hearings, or it's a group hearing. That is, it's not just one nominee in front of the committee getting grilled, but it's a panel of people, sometimes for unrelated positions. Talk through those cases first before we get to the sexy cases of the spotlight hearings.
Yeah, so basically, any civilian nominee to the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy Nuclear Weapons Program, the Senate committee is always going to have a hearing for those civilian nominees. No exceptions. In all the years, 50 plus years I've been doing this, I've never seen an exception for that. Now, there's certain privileged nominations that you don't have to have a hearing, but the committee, for example, the Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller doesn't actually have to have a hearing, but they always require a hearing. So on the 65 civilian nominees, they're always going to have a hearing. The Secretary of Defense will have a hearing by themselves, but most of the others are going to be part of a panel just because of the workload of the Senate. So typically, even a service secretary is going to be packaged up with an under or an assistant, things of that nature. We've actually had military nominees that have been packaged up with the civilian nominees. Now, on the military, as I mentioned, there's over 1,000 flag and general officers. Anybody below the rank of 1-star or 1-star admiral or general is not going to have a hearing. So captain to major, major to lieutenant colonel to colonel, or in the Navy, commander to captain, they're not going to have a confirmation hearing. Those 40 to 50,000 nominations are going to that are subject to statutory promotion boards and DOD, they're going to go through the committee without a hearing. Flag and general officers below the rank of 3 stars, so the 1, 2, and 3 stars, rarely, if ever, will have a confirmation hearing. And on the 4 stars, the ones that are going to have a confirmation hearing are a service chief and member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, of which there are 8, the chairman, the vice chairman, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, Space Force, chief of the National Guard Bureau, and the combatant commanders. They always have a hearing for the 11 warfighting combatant commanders: U.S. Central Command, U.S. Southern Command, U.S. Northern Command, U.S. Cyber Command, U.S. Strategic Command. Those are always going to have a hearing. So 65 civilians, 5 DOE nuclear on the civilian side, and then that handful of military, the 11 warfighting command, 4-star warfighting commanders, and the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Those are who are going to have actual hearings.
So the hearings that get the most attention are the ones that go badly. And it's unfortunate. I think it's human nature, but it's the fireworks, right? It's the ones that something dramatic happens. And this can come in several flavors. Not a confirmation hearing, but I recall a hearing where a U.S. official, I believe an Assistant Secretary of State, was testifying, and one of the members of the House in that case mistook her for a foreign government official and was speaking to her as if she was representing a foreign government and not the U.S. government's executive branch. In a confirmation hearing, there tend to be groups of issues that come up that derail candidates. I believe your checklist has them as integrity, the feeling that you're above the law or that the rules don't apply to you, the God complex, if you will, and then leadership deficiencies in previous positions. Which of those have you seen are most common in the hearings themselves? And frankly, why do those issues get to a hearing at all when there's been a vetting process and you would think that people would have the conversation before they're in a live hearing that these issues are going to be coming up?
The ones that trip people up the most are the personal issues. And sometimes executive branches have a lower standard for what they're willing to live with than does the United States Senate. So things where the executive branch will send it up to the U.S. Senate, and the Senate says, wait a minute, the fact that they were late on paying their taxes or the fact that they didn't pay their domestic help appropriately, even though you look the other way, we're not looking the other way. And certainly, if you withhold information and you get caught withholding the information, that's a problem. But on the other side, in terms of the substantive issues, the things that tend to get the most heat are basically if the Senate is controlled by a branch of a party and they don't agree with some of the major national security policy positions, then the person that's coming to testify represents the administration. As a civilian, you're not entitled to personal views. You represent the views of the administration. So they're going to hold Derek Chalet, or they're going to hold him responsible for the what people believe was a bad withdrawal from Afghanistan. So they get fly-spec on something like that. And then if they basically have done something on social media that people don't consider appropriate, they're going to get fly-spec on that. And then the last category is really, as you mentioned, those people that basically think they're smarter than everybody else. And, being honest, these tend to be people that are former senators or congressmen, and they think they're going to kind of get the cakewalk from their fellow colleagues, and it doesn't happen. What I call lack of preparation. The biggest problem that I've seen over the years and why people run into problems in the confirmation process is lack of preparation. Prepare. And if they don't prepare well and they don't do well, it hurts them if they even do get confirmed, and some of them don't get confirmed because of their lack of preparation.
There's one other thing that we haven't mentioned yet, but I've certainly recall seeing instances where you could actually see senators of both parties rising up with indignation when a nominee gives an error or a comment that there's a presumption of confirmation. Right. That is, they say something like, well, as secretary, I'm going to do this, instead of, if confirmed, or the things that I would want to consult with the committee about, if confirmed, are this. That seems to be taken very seriously by almost everybody in the process, right?
That's right. And the reason I titled the book, If Confirmed, that's kind of the bedrock of the confirmation process.
Yeah.
To me, the primary example I use is Graham Allison in the Clinton administration. Graham Allison, a most distinguished author, a most distinguished professor, somebody that's one of the great experts in national security. He's nominated by President Clinton to be an assistant secretary of defense. Well, Graham's a hard charger, so he's over in the Pentagon and he's making decisions and hiring people and doing things before he ever had his confirmation hearing. Well, that kind of got back to the committee. Some of the career civil servants sort of ratted him out. And obviously, of course, the Senate takes great exception to people. And there's a general counsel ruling. And usually at the beginning of any administration, the new general counsel comes in and says, this is what you can and can't do as a nominee. And there's very little you can do as a nominee. In fact, you can do hardly anything. But Graham had to come up and some people said kiss the ring or kiss something else, but he certainly had to do the genuflection to get through the process. And the committee, and that's why when we teach people and prep people for confirmation, we always say use the term if confirmed, because if the Senate doesn't confirm you, you're not going to be able to do any of what you plan to do. And so it's a sign of appropriate respect for the confirmation process, but also a recognition of the rules of the road that DOD puts out on its own nominees. Mm-hmm. And, there have been people that have tried to skirt it in the past. They always get caught, and we always teach them a lesson. The Senate teaches them a lesson. So you're not going to get away with it. And so if confirmed is why I gave that the title of the book. Yep. The other thing, another good example was we require the military 3 and 4 stars, whether you're going to have a hearing or not. If you're not having a hearing, you fill out a paperwork form, and it says, if asked, will you give your personal views, even if they differ from the administration in power? We want the military to give their best military judgments. So Admiral Kelso was nominated to be the Chief of Naval Operations. And he's before my boss, Senator Nunn, is chairman of the committee. And Senator Nunn's asking the standard question, Admiral Kelso, and he was there with a couple other military nominees. If asked, will you give your personal views, even if they differ from the administration in power? Admiral Kelso's initial answer was, Senator, I would first want to check with the Secretary of Defense. And Chairman Nunn says, well, Admiral, the answer is either yes or no. You can give either. If you answer no, you won't be confirmed. Admiral Kelso, yes, Mr. Chairman. And so basically, there's some rules of the road that, as a nominee, you've got to adhere to. If you presume the outcome of the confirmation process, and by the way, that's a question that every civilian nominee gets asked and every military nominee gets asked at the actual hearing. Have you done anything to presume the outcome of the confirmation process? If you answer yes, and none of them do because they know they wouldn't be confirmed, the answer is no. So that's a sacrosanct rule that's been under every party, every chairman, and it's not going to change because basically the Senate is very, very protective of their advice and consent role.
You mentioned in there that in the last 25 years, you've advised and consulted with hundreds, perhaps thousands of people who have gone before the committee and other committees for confirmation. You mentioned the presumption of confirmation issue. We've talked generally about integrity and leadership issues. But how do you advise people to get through what I think is one of the thorniest issues in a hearing? It's not, are you prepped for the 64,000 substantive questions that could come up? People need to prep for those, but that's relatively easy. You do your homework. For me, it's the hypothetical questions, because sometimes the hypothetical questions are based on very likely contingencies. What happens if Russia does this with Ukraine next week? Or what happens when this trend we're seeing actually continues? Some of those are reasonable analytic questions for anybody occupying a policy role, and yet hypotheticals are notoriously thorny. So what's your best advice to people going before a hearing on how to handle hypothetical questions from the senators?
I mean, we basically advise people to use what we call the artful dodge, and that is basically, particularly on hypotheticals, because you don't want to really get anywhere near something like that. And that is, Senator, since I'm not confirmed, I'm not sufficiently well informed on that particular issue to be able to give you the thoughtful answer you deserve. But if confirmed, that's something that I will undertake right away and look forward to getting back to you. So you basically just dodged the answer. And because you, as you pointed out, it's very, very risky to get into hypotheticals. And frankly, when in the national security area, there's just too many uncertainties. Basically, if you get asked a hypothetical, well, do you think Putin's going to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, kind of thing? Our most sophisticated intelligence people that monitor this 24/7, they don't know how to answer that question either. So basically, we advise nominees, if they are not well informed on a subject, or if the administration doesn't have a position on that, they certainly aren't authorized as a civilian to take a position that the administration hasn't taken. On the military, it's a little bit different. If you're having a hearing as a military nominee, you're a very senior person. You're a 4-star, either 3 going to 4 or 4 going to another 4-star position. You've got 30 to 35 years of experience, and you're going to have a much harder time dodging an answer to a question than a civilian that's never been before the Senate and maybe going into the government for the first time. And so they're going to expect the military to be a lot better informed. And by the way, they're currently, if you're a 3 going to 4 or 4 going to another 4-star, you're in the government every single day and have been. And so you're expected to be much more knowledgeable and substantive than a civilian nominee.
Mm-hmm. There's one special case that I want to ask you about. The Secretary of Defense has one unique thing attached to him or her, and that is that in law, the Secretary of Defense cannot be an active duty officer or a recent active duty officer. And yet anybody can look at the list of Secretaries of Defense and find that in the few dozen that we've had, I think we're up to 3 now who have been in that position. Each of them required special legislation to do so. And I have to say, while I think that, George Marshall was a remarkable American, and I think that others who have received such a waiver are accomplished individuals, it is a bit ridiculous to think that of the 340 million Americans, that there literally is only one person who is capable of holding that position at the highest level, and we must have special legislation to allow the waiver. So talk through the thoughts on this, both from your experience working in Senate staff and in the decades since, where it now has happened quite frequently lately. How you feel about the Secretary of Defense waiver, and what, if anything, needs to change, given that we seem to be dealing with exceptions almost as much as the rule?
Well, I personally am not in favor of retired military ever serving as the Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense is the only other civilian in the chain of command. Even the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is not in the chain of command. We want absolute civilian control of the military, from the President, Commander-in-Chief, to the Secretary of Defense, to the warfighting commanders. Even George Marshall, in the unique circumstance where Truman asked him to, here's an individual that served as Secretary of State, a warfighting commander, George Marshall said, this is unique. Military people should not be the Secretary of Defense. He was not in favor of it either. And the problem is good individuals as these are, and certainly I've known General Mattis and General Austin and worked with them off and on over the years. When you have served in the military for 30, 35, 40 years, you bring a certain point of view to that position, and you grew up in a different situation than a civilian, and it's hard to change those stripes, even when you become the Secretary of Defense, notwithstanding the jobs that either one of them did. So I personally have never been in favor of the waiver. We made sure the 10-year provision was in there because you never can predict the world's circumstances, and maybe there would be a circumstance. It got reduced to 7. Mike Gallagher a couple of years ago put it back to 10. I think I would be extremely surprised to see a retired military person serving as Secretary of Defense and getting that waiver through the Congress anytime in the foreseeable future. I think there's a general recognition that we want civilians to serve as the civilian Secretary of Defense.
Yeah. It's so hard, as you pointed out at the top, that so many norms and practices have changed, in part due to volume. There's that.
Right.
But in part due to political and partisan issues that are technically not the confirmation process itself, that it's really hard to predict what could happen in 10 or 20 years with what people are willing to tolerate and not. But yeah, you have rules for a reason. And if you're finding exceptions for them frequently or back to back, then something needs to change, right? Let's talk about another case that we mentioned earlier that we'll come back to, which is holds. That senators can put a hold on a confirmation process. The one that I remember, and I'm sure there were some that I've simply forgotten, but I remember in the 1990s when Richard Holbrooke was nominated to be, I believe it was USUN, the ambassador to the United Nations, which of course requires confirmation as an ambassadorial position. And there was a hold put on him. Talk through that case and then how normal it is until recent history. Let's not get to a certain Senator Tuberville yet, but let's get to up until the last couple of years. How normal was it for a senator to put a hold on a nominee for an issue unrelated to that person's suitability?
Well, my position has been and is now and will be in the future. If a senator has a problem with the individual's qualifications, behavior, integrity, and puts a hold on for that reason, that's a legitimate hold, and you need to work through that. What happened with Richard Holbrooke, and Richard Holbrooke was a national security expert, and there was actually a term developed after the hold was put on him because it was so unusual at the time. It's not unusual today, but so unusual at the time that a hold was put on him over a policy that he really was not involved in and couldn't change even if he wanted to try to put pressure on the executive branch to get that policy changed. They developed a term called Holbrooked, meaning, you got held up for no reason of your own. Now, I will say that Ambassador Holbrooke ultimately did get confirmed. He did serve in various positions in other administrations as well. He was an individual that was quite impressed with himself, and so he didn't have a lot of friendly supporters, in certain quarters, and so there could have been a little of that there. But he was basically held up, over an issue that he had nothing to do with, and so that was very unique back then. It's very commonplace today.
Okay, so let's talk about the elephant in the room. Senator Tuberville's hold. The basics of it. Well, I'll let you tell the story because you monitored it extremely carefully, but it was historically unusual for its length, if not its scope.
Well, it was actually unprecedented, never happened before, and to show you how we never let that happen, I'll just use an example. When my boss, Senator Nunn, was chairman, and Wendell Ford, who was the number 2 Democratic leader in the Senate, head of the Rules Committee, good friend of Senator Nunn's, he had an issue with the Air Force in his home state. And so he put a hold on a senior Air Force nominee. I got called by the floor, hey, Arnold, Wendell Ford just put a hold on General so-and-so. I immediately told Senator Nunn. Senator Nunn, basically, because he felt like it was so inappropriate to hold up a military nomination over an issue in your state, even though it related to the Air Force, he immediately went to the Senate floor, tracked down Wendell Ford. Again, good friends. I went to the floor with him. Hey, Wendell, we don't do that. We don't hold up military nominations. If you want to leverage the government, why don't you hold the civilian secretary of the Air Force instead, which he did. And so, that was kind of the norm. And we rarely, if ever, saw holds on military nominees. Senator Tuberville decided to place a hold that lasted over 8 months, and it affected over 900 flag and general officers over a policy that the Pentagon had taken that he disagreed with. Is it related to paying for abortions out of state for military members that were stationed in the state that didn't permit it, that needed it for medical reasons or other reasons. And of course, the military had nothing to do with that policy. They were not in a position to change it. But he basically dug in, even over the objection of a lot of his own colleagues, and held them up for over 9 months. So very unprecedented, very unfortunate. And it even held up the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and some service things. And I myself was against using cloture because I felt, we were going to turn the military into political pawns and just like federal judges. But because C.Q. Brown was held up and needed to take over on 1 October, the leader decided to do cloture for him, and they did cloture for a couple of the other service chiefs. So that unfortunate Rubicon has been passed, and it was very, very unfortunate, and had a very adverse impact on the military that they're still digging out from under. Senator Tim Kaine in this year's NDAA, because in the military you only get paid when your data rank occurs. Some of these people were losing, close to $50,000 a year, and these are people that have been in government their entire life. That's a lot of money for a military family. They've authorized back pay for those people. And Senator Tuberville, to his great credit, is supporting that legislation, but he still did something that was totally inappropriate. And by the way, the people that went after him on the floor was his Republican colleagues on the Armed Services Committee that had actually seen a shot fired in anger. Dan Sullivan from Alaska Marine, Joni Ernst, National Guard, deployed to combat, and they put pressure on him, Todd Young, Lindsey Graham, and others, that he ultimately relented. But a lot of damage was done, and unfortunately a very bad precedent was set. And as much as we'd like to think it's not going to happen again, it is going to happen again.
Were you surprised that he held out that long? Because as well as I do, the pressure on him behind the scenes from colleagues and from others, including prominent people in his own state.
Right.
The fact that it went on so long, that, first of all, you could just say stubborn individual who doesn't respond well to being pressured. But there's a whole lot of business that gets done in the U.S. Senate because of colleagues looking out for each other, helping each other.
He was raising a lot. He was raising a lot of money off that position because the anti-abortion people were very supportive. Number two, he never served in uniform, really didn't understand our military, had no clue as to what, the damage that was really being done. Unlike his colleague Dan Sullivan, who served in combat, Joni Ernst had served in combat, others that had served in combat, and he kept saying, the number 2 or number 3 people can take over. And the example I used to use, I said, well, look, he coached the University of Auburn football team. We, of course, at the University of Georgia have whipped them pretty badly in recent years. But if he was playing Alabama in the knockdown, drag-out game every year, and his first-string quarterback is ready to go, he's not going to start his fourth-string quarterback. That's what he was arguing our military ought to do. Mm-hmm. If we wanted the number 3 or number 4 person in that chain of command to be the number 1 person, we'd have picked him to be the number 1 person. We tell America's mothers and fathers that you send your sons and daughters to us, they're going to be the best trained, the best equipped, and the best led. He basically was saying, don't put the best leaders in charge. So he was pretty clueless about what our military is all about. Yeah. It was not just he was stubborn. It was not just that he was raising money. Not just that it was politically advantageous to the anti-abortion crowd, but he was just really clueless about what our military is all about.
Absolutely. I do want to close with some of your recommendations. You've already mentioned several areas that you think are, what shall we say, ripe for reform based on the way the system has evolved. But there's 3 in particular I'd like you to comment on. One is you urge a decrease in the number of Senate confirmed positions. And by saying that, you're not saying that the assistant secretary of this or that is unimportant, but there still is logic why they don't need to be Senate confirmed given the structure of the Department of Defense. So make the best case why the number of Senate confirmed positions can be reduced.
Well, I would say, first of all, the president and the secretary of defense ought to want the people that they want in those key positions there as quickly as possible. And the only way they're going to get them there as quickly as possible if they have fewer of them that actually have to go through the United States Senate. Mm-hmm. They're just as important. They're just as influential. You still need the best qualified people. But because they have an undersecretary structure in both the military departments and in OSD, you've got that civilian control, political control, and a representative of the president that they would actually work for. I would significantly reduce the number from 65, the ASDs in both the military departments and at OSD. You'd still let them carry the title of the honorable, and they'd have to commit in writing that to testify if asked to testify. And so you could cover that, and you're going to still get, and you're going to get them there more quickly. So it basically, in terms of the concern the Senate has about vacant positions is, which they create some of the vacancies, you'd get the people there in a more timely fashion, and you'd still want the high quality people in those positions. In terms of the military, there's no reason for the Senate to have to consider people that go before a statutory promotion board. Again, the field grade officers, 40,000 plus a year, just a ridiculous amount of work. They don't have hearings, and they're very routine because of the statutory requirements and the reviews that are required and adverse information that have to go before the board. You're not picking people that shouldn't be picked for promotion to the next higher grade. Right. And I would say I would keep the number of flag and general officers, the 1, 2, 3, and 4 stars that have to go through the confirmation process. But it's in most of them, like I said, only a few of the 4 stars have hearings. So if you reduce the number like I'm talking about, you would significantly reduce the Senate's workload, where they could spend more time, more quality time, looking at the more senior civilian positions. So that'd be on the number of positions. In terms of the paperwork, we've talked about that. I'd go to the total electronic, have both branches use the same paperwork. I'd have an electronic dashboard. Nominees now don't even know where their nomination is. There's very little feedback, and you could track it whether you were in government or out of government. And then the final thing, and the one that would be most problematic for the U.S. Senate, is a time certain in committee and a time certain on the Senate executive calendar for an individual that basically is getting the slow roll. So if you get referred to the committee, and if the committee doesn't have a hearing and reports you out by a certain date, it automatically gets discharged, goes on the Senate executive calendar. If somebody places a hold on that nominee, the parliamentarian would rule whether that hold is germane or not. If it's germane, meaning you're holding them up because of a problem with the nominee, then the automatic kick-in time certain doesn't apply. But if it's not germane, then there would be a date certain for when that nomination would actually kick up and get a vote. And so the Senate and the House, then the executive branch are both, if they want to basically operate our government in the modern world that we live in, we're going to have to make these adjustments. Both sides are going to have to give up some of their prerogatives. And again, everything in the Senate operates on unanimous consent. Frankly, as much as I believe in the filibuster, meaning you in the Senate, you want basically the minority to have rights that frankly they don't have in the House of Representatives. I think, frankly, the days of the filibuster are numbered. I just think that basically there are so many of the new people that are coming to the Senate in the world the way that it is, the ability of one senator, and it's not just on nominations, it's on any policy. Basically, you can't hardly get anything passed. It's hard to get a vote on anything. Both sides like these walk the plank votes, meaning they just voting on things to basically use against them in a political campaign. The legislative branch, Norm Ornstein, who's one of the really astute observers of Congress, refers to Congress as the broken branch. And they really are broken. It's not just the confirmation process. So these 3 changes could make a huge difference in actually implementing the vision the founding fathers had for the role of the Senate in the advising consent process.
And I have to say that listening to you lay it out, it's almost impossible to argue logically against those points. That is, you have reason on your side and you have evidence, like the fact that there's dozens of positions in the Department of Defense that require Senate confirmation, but those positions are in turn overseen by at least 2 levels of Senate confirmed positions already.
That's correct.
So you have logic, you have argumentation, you have evidence. But what I'm not sure you have is the will of the Senate. And that's for 2 reasons. One is you have a very strong, as you know better than most of us, a very strong preservation of the role of the Senate, and we must do things and we can't cross the branches. So even sharing a similar form for a nominee between the executive branch and the legislative branch, there's going to be some people who say, no, we're going to do it our way because that's an important principle. And then secondly, it's so hard to get anything passed these days, even something like reasonable budget issues or authorizations, I should say, that getting the majority of the Senate to agree on rolling back some of these things, you tell me, without naming any names, I don't want to violate any confidences, but do you think that there's enough of a will in the Senate to enact some of these common sense reforms?
I would say on the first two, reducing the number, there's interest and actually some support in terms of streamlining the paperwork because it's happening everywhere, finance, business, government, USA jobs, to get a job in government, anything. I think there's opening for basically streamlining the paperwork. I would say changing the Senate rules to basically have a time certain for getting a national security nomination done is what I would say probably is in the too hard box. And why the reason I say it's in the too hard box, as hard as I'm going to work for it, and I've found a couple of people that might be interested, one senator of 100 has unlimited power because the United States Senate cannot do anything without permission of that one senator, whoever that one senator is. Everything's done by unanimous consent. One senator has immense power. Those individual senators are not going to want to give up that power, particularly if they came from the House of Representatives. If you're in the minority, you have no power whatsoever. You're just run over like a steamroller. And so I think getting that changed is going to be very, very difficult. But we need to get caught trying to make it work for the modern world that we live in.
Yeah, I fear you're right, but I hope you're wrong on that last point, because I think it would be, honestly, to the benefit of effective oversight and effective hearings for the other positions.
And I argue that you wouldn't do it for all of government. You just do it for national security nominations. National security nominations, let's be honest, I think they're different.
Yep.
I mean, they have the fate of our troops in their hands, and they have the fate of our country in their hands. Yes, there are a lot of other important functions of government, but basically deterring our adversaries, of which there are many and very powerful, Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, global terrorism, and if deterrence fails, being able to protect America. And by the way, guess what? Two oceans don't protect us anymore. We can be attacked from space. We can be attacked from cyber. So these warfighting commanders are very, very important. And so to me, a difference ought to be made for the national security nominees as opposed to other type of nominees.
Yeah. Well, we close out our conversations here by reaching into our so-called chatterbox and pulling out a random question.
Okay.
So here we go. Who was your mentor?
Well, I've been very, very fortunate to have my parents. My father, Arnold Punaro, was a 1938 graduate of the Citadel, served with Patton's Army in World War II. My mother, Anita Benedetto Punaro, served in the Army as a dietitian in World War II. My mother was a teacher, and my father was a small businessman. Then I was very fortunate when I went in the Marine Corps. My first company commander in Vietnam was Captain Jim Van Riper, one of the legendary Marines of yore. So I learned leadership in combat from one of the finest Marines. Then I get to the United States Senate, worked for Senator Sam Nunn, by all accounts, one of the most legendary national security experts. Met General Jim Jones and General Pete Pace and a lot of the flag and general officers. When I left into the business world, I was very fortunate to work for companies where we had great business leaders. And over time, David Joyce at General Electric Company, Ken Dahlberg at SAIC, the ones I work with today in the business world. So I've been just very, very fortunate. Plus my own immediate family has always been very helpful and very supportive. But I would say my own parents taught me a sense of doing what's right always, making sure that you don't cook the books and things of that nature. And those leadership traits that were instilled in me and reinforced in the United States Marine Corps in combat, and having young Marines that were drafted and never wanted to be in combat but did everything their country asked of them and more, really brings things home. And so I've been just one of the luckiest people to have these kind of people as my mentors.
That is a very impressive list. And most importantly, across your entire life, right? Most people think of mentorship as, well, when I'm first starting out, I need that one person who sets me on the right path. And I think we shouldn't minimize that. But the fact that you're still recognizing mentors when you have been a mentor to others for so many years is something we should all take away. Arnold, thank you for spending so much time talking about the confirmation process, the obstacles in the way, and potential reforms. I'll mention again your new book, If Confirmed, The Insider's View of the National Security Confirmation Process. And I'll encourage all the listeners to check that out because there's many more stories, many more facts and figures than we have time to get into even in an hour plus. Thank you for joining us.
Well, such a privilege to be with you and your listeners.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.